May 9th, 1971. 12:16 p.m. Unity Funeral Home, 2357 Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard. Frank Lucas walked through the front doors alone with a submachine gun under his coat, and the NYPD officers on the sidewalk didn't move to stop him, because stopping him meant starting something they couldn't finish. Inside, a man lay in a casket with his hands folded like a saint. Outside, Harlem was splitting into pieces worth thousands per hour, and Frank came to collect. Only nobody in that room could agree on what, exactly, he was there to take. The bell above the glass door made a thin, tired sound, like it had been rung too many times by too many grieving hands. Warm air, flowers starting to sweat, cheap cologne fighting funeral lilies and losing. Unity was packed tight. Men in black suits shoulder to shoulder, women in dark hats pressed against the walls, kids told to stay quiet, but watching everything anyway. Every face was doing the same math. Who's here? Who's missing? Who's armed? Who's about to move first? Frank Lucas didn't pause for permission. He moved like he owned time, like time owed him. His coat was dark, plain, too big in the shoulders. His shoes were clean enough to make you notice. On his left wrist, a cheap watch. Not jewelry, a tool. The kind of detail you remembered later because it didn't match the rumor. He walked past the first row of folding chairs, and the room performed a silent correction. Bodies angled. Jackets shifted. Men created space without looking like they were afraid to create space. Because in Harlem, after Bumpy Johnson died, space was the first thing people stole. 2 months earlier, the corners that used to run smooth, like a system, started to get chopped into personal fiefdoms. 116th Street had one crew on the east side and another crew on the west side, both selling the same product, both claiming the same permission. Lenox Avenue turned into a line you crossed at your own risk. A single block could clear 10, 15,000 a week depending on the day, depending on the weather, depending on how hungry the cops were. And the cops were always hungry. Frank knew the numbers. Everybody in that room knew he knew. That's why the weapon under his coat mattered more than the weapon itself. A gun was a statement, but it was also an invitation. A man near the aisle, mid-30s, thick neck, hair combed hard and shiny, leaned back just enough to clear his jacket. His fingers touched something at his waist. Not drawing, just reminding everybody he could. Frank didn't look at the hand. He looked at the man's throat, like he was measuring where sound came from, like he was deciding whose voice would be allowed in the room. The casket sat up front under a soft light that made the dead look expensive. The deceased wore a crisp suit, tie pin, new shoes. Someone had spent real money to make him look like he'd never been afraid a day in his life. Frank took 3 more steps. A woman in the second row, eyes red but dry, stared straight ahead like she'd made a deal with herself not to blink. Behind her, 2 men in identical black coats stood too close to the wall to be mourners. Their hands were low. Their shoulders were high. Frank stopped exactly 6 feet from the casket. 6 feet. The same distance you'd give a stranger on a sidewalk. The same distance you'd give an animal you didn't know could bite. Nobody spoke. In that silence, you could hear everything else. The radiator ticking, a baby somewhere in the back making a tiny sound, the muted traffic outside, a police radio squawking once and cutting off. Frank's right hand moved under his coat. Not fast, not slow, controlled. The thick-necked man near the aisle shifted his weight like a sprinter settling into the blocks. One of the wall men dipped his chin a fraction, eyes cutting toward the door, toward the NYPD shapes behind the glass. And right then, one of the officers outside did something small that told you how real this was. He turned his body so his badge was less visible, like he didn't want it to be the reason he got shot. Frank's hand came out, and it wasn't holding what the room expected. It was holding something thin and white. A folded program. He placed it on the edge of the casket, neat as a bill on a table. That move confused people. Confusion is dangerous in a room full of guns. Men didn't know whether to laugh or relax or take it as an insult. In Harlem, respect and disrespect were sometimes the same action depending on who watched it happen. Frank leaned in slightly, eyes on the dead man's face, and spoke for the first time. Not loud, not for the whole room, just loud enough to make the people closest to him strain to hear. "Your people been busy," he said. The thick-necked man answered without looking like he was answering. His lips barely moved. "Busy how?" Frank's gaze didn't leave the casket. "Taking things," he said. "That ain't theirs." A third voice cut in from behind, sharper, younger. "Who's gonna stop him?" Frank turned his head toward that voice like a camera pan. Slow. Unhurried. He found a kid, maybe 22, trying too hard to look like a man. New suit. Cheap tie. The kind of confidence you borrow from a gun because you haven't earned it yet. Frank watched him for a long second. Then he smiled. Just enough to be mistaken for kindness if you didn't know what a smile could do. "You really asking me that in here?" Frank said. That line landed hard because it didn't answer the question. It questioned the question. It made the kid feel stupid in front of his own people. And stupidity in a room like this was blood in the water. The funeral director, a small man with a shiny forehead and hands that wouldn't stop adjusting invisible wrinkles, took one step forward before thinking better of it. He froze, caught between business and survival. Frank didn't acknowledge him. He didn't acknowledge anyone who didn't matter. Instead, he did something that pulled the attention of every person in that room into a tight fist. He reached into his coat again. This time his hand came out heavier. The outline was unmistakable now. Metal. Dark. Long. A weapon that didn't belong in a place where people pretended to be civilized for an hour. A woman gasped. Quick. Involuntary. Like the sound escaped her before her pride could catch it. The thick-necked man near the aisle finally let his hand slide closer to his own waistband. Still not drawing, but closer. Frank held the weapon low, angled down, not pointing at anyone. Which, in a way, was worse. Pointing a gun was a threat. Not pointing it was a promise that you didn't need to. He didn't lift it. He didn't fire. He just let them see that he had brought it, and that he wasn't worried about the consequences. Outside, an officer muttered to another one. The words lost behind the glass, but the body language was clear. "Don't. Not here. Not today." Frank stepped 1 inch closer to the casket and spoke again, same calm tone. "Everybody wanna wear Bumpy's crown now that he gone," he said. "Problem is, crowns don't fit everybody." A man in the back laughed once, short and ugly, like he wanted to break the tension and accidentally admitted he was scared. The laugh died immediately when no one joined it. Then came the first real hit, the kind that flips a room. A voice from the side, older, gravelly, confident, said, "You got guts coming in here alone, Frank." Frank turned, found the speaker. A man in his 50s, suit cut better than most, face calm like he'd practiced calm in mirrors. This wasn't a soldier. This was management. Frank didn't ask his name. He didn't need to. Harlem had a small list of men who could talk like that and live to talk again. Frank nodded once, like he'd been waiting for this voice. "I ain't alone," Frank said. And in that moment, half the room instinctively looked toward the door, because they thought he meant men. Guns. Backup. But Frank's eyes drifted to the casket again when he said the next part. "I got memory," he said. "And I got receipts." Receipts. That word changed everything. Because receipts weren't bullets. Receipts were names, dates, sums, and places. Receipts were what you used to make a man disappear without firing a shot. Receipts were what you used to turn a gangster into a defendant. The older man's expression didn't change, but his throat tightened. Just a little. "You threatening the dead?" he asked. Frank's smile went away. "I'm talking to the living," he said. A pause. Then Frank did the thing that made even the cops outside stop pretending this was just a funeral. He looked at the thick-necked man near the aisle and called him by his real name. Not a street name. Not a nickname. His government name. "Clarence," Frank said. The room stiffened. Even Clarence stiffened. Because the fastest way to strip power off a gangster was to remind him he was once a kid with a birth certificate. Clarence's jaw tightened. "Don't." Frank cut him off with a small tilt of the weapon, still down, still not aimed, but now undeniably present in the conversation. "February 3rd, Frank said. 1:12 a.m. You took 2 of my runners off 129th and Lenox. You made him strip. You took the envelopes. You left one of them bleeding in the snow by the mailbox." The young kid in the new suit blinked hard. The woman in the second row went pale. Clarence's eyes flicked to his men, checking who knew, checking who didn't, checking who might have talked. Frank wasn't done. March 18th, he said. You sat at Wells' restaurant on 116th, booth by the window. You met with Detective Harlan from the 28th. He took a brown envelope off you, not even trying to hide it. 3 stacks, $100 bands. You paid for the cops to look the other way while you grabbed 2 blocks that weren't yours. The funeral director swallowed so hard you could hear it. Outside, one of the NYPD officers, an older guy with a tired face, shifted his stance, like he'd just heard his own name in his head. Detective Harlan. That wasn't a rumor. That was a blade. Clarence tried to speak again. His voice came out rough. You don't know what you're talking about. Frank's eyes narrowed, not in anger, more like focus. I know the serial numbers on the bills you handed him, Frank said. That was either true, or it was the kind of lie you told when you wanted a man to feel like it was true. In the street, belief did the same work as evidence. The older man in the better suit took a step forward, palm open like he was calming a dog. Frank, he said, this ain't the place. Frank didn't move. He let the room sit in the idea that the place was exactly the point. This the perfect place, Frank said. Ain't nobody supposed to lie at a funeral. A few people actually glanced at the casket again, like the dead man might sit up and referee. Frank lowered his voice. You took from Bumpy's house when the body wasn't even cold, he said. You took corners. You took money. You took people's safety. And you did it 'cause you thought the only man who'd come for you was in the ground. He nodded toward the casket, small motion. You thought he was the end of it. Frank's gaze swept the room once, finally. Not frantic, not fearful, like a landlord checking his building. But I'm the part you didn't price in, he said. A woman whispered something like a prayer. It wasn't loud. It was just human. Outside, a police radio crackled again. A voice said something sharp, urgent. The officers looked at each other like they were receiving instructions they didn't want to follow. And then the second hit landed, quiet, surgical. The front door opened behind Frank. Not wide, just enough. And a man stepped in, mid-30s, plain suit, no tie, hands visible. He didn't look like muscle. He looked like paperwork. He walked to the side wall and stood there, expression blank. Frank didn't turn to look at him. He didn't have to, because the older man in the better suit recognized him instantly. So did one of the cops outside, through the glass, because the cop's shoulders rose like he'd just seen a ghost. That man was a city investigator. The kind that didn't wear a uniform. The kind that didn't need to. The kind that meant this funeral home now had 2 kinds of danger in it. Street danger and legal danger. Clarence's eyes darted. For the first time, he looked less like a gangster and more like a guy who realized he might be going to court. The older man's voice turned careful. What is this? He asked. Frank finally turned slightly, enough to acknowledge the new arrival. This, Frank said, is me doing it clean. Clean. The word made people flinch. Because clean was never clean in Harlem. Clean just meant you bled somewhere else. Frank lifted the funeral program off the casket with 2 fingers, like it might be contaminated, and unfolded it. Inside was a small piece of paper, tucked into the crease. He held it up so only the first row could see it. Typed. Official looking. Names. Dates. A stamp. Not a gun. Not a knife. Something colder. He tapped it once with his finger. You got 2 options, Frank said, voice steady as a metronome. You give back what you took, every corner, every runner, every debt you collected that wasn't yours, by Friday. Midnight. Clarence let out a laugh that had no humor in it. Or what? Frank's eyes met his. And for the first time, Frank let the room see a hint of anger. Not hot, not wild. Controlled, like a door closing. Where your name stops being a street name, Frank said, and starts being a case file. That line didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a plan. A kid in the back whispered, he got papers. Another voice hissed, shut up. The older man in the better suit tried another angle. Soft power. Negotiation. You can't just walk in here and… Frank cut him off. I can, Frank said. I just did. Silence. And then the briefest relief, like the room thought maybe it could buy its way out. The older man said, how much? Frank didn't even blink. This ain't about a number, he said. This about a message. He turned toward the casket again, like he was speaking to the dead, and the living couldn't stand that disrespect. You stole from a man who kept this neighborhood from burning, Frank said. Now you want me to play nice. He leaned in, close enough that someone could smell the soap on his collar. Close enough to make it personal. Nice don't work, he said. The young kid in the new suit, trying to prove himself, did the stupid thing. The predictable thing. The thing every room full of men is waiting for one idiot to do. He stepped forward. His hand came up from his jacket. Not all the way, not fully drawn, but enough. And time tightened, like a string pulled to the point it might snap. The cops outside leaned forward instinctively. A woman in the second row squeezed her eyes shut. Frank didn't raise his weapon. He didn't point it. He just turned his head, eyes locking onto the kid's hand like a spotlight. And he spoke to the kid like he was talking to a child about to touch a stove. Don't, Frank said. One word. Flat. Final. The kid hesitated, half a beat. The worst half beat of his life. Because in that half beat, another man, standing behind him, older, smarter, grabbed the kid's wrist and yanked it down hard. Not gentle. Not kind. A correction. A lesson. The kid's face flushed with humiliation. He opened his mouth to protest. The older man behind him hissed into his ear. You trying to get everybody killed? Killed. That word bounced through the room, even though nobody had said it loud. Everybody heard it anyway. Frank watched the kid for a second longer, then looked back at Clarence. That's the difference, Frank said quietly. I'm not here to lose control. Clarence swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed like it wanted to escape. The older man in the better suit took a breath and made a decision. You could see it in his shoulders. He was choosing survival over pride. Friday, he said. Midnight. We hear you. Frank nodded once. Not gratitude. Not acceptance. Confirmation. He slid the folded paper back into the funeral program and placed it on the casket again, exactly where it had been. He smoothed it with his palm like he was straightening a bed sheet. Then he turned toward the funeral director. The director flinched like he'd been shot. Frank spoke to him like a customer. Make sure he look right, Frank said, nodding to the body. His mama deserved that. The director blinked, confused by the sudden normality, and nodded too fast. Yes, yes, Mr. Lucas. Frank started walking back down the aisle. And here came the third hit, the one that left the aftertaste. As he passed Clarence, Frank stopped. Just for a second. He leaned in close enough that only Clarence could hear him. But the room watched their faces, and faces told the story even without sound. Frank said something short. Clarence's eyes widened just a fraction. Frank straightened, kept walking. At the door, he paused and looked back at the entire room one last time. He didn't raise the gun. He didn't make a speech. He just let them see him leave the same way he entered. Unrushed, unafraid, untouched. Outside, the NYPD officers pretended they hadn't been holding their breath. One of them stared at Frank's coat, like he could see through it. Another looked away, jaw tight, as if looking too long would make him complicit. Frank stepped onto the sidewalk and the afternoon light hit his face. A car idled at the curb, dark Buick Electra, engine low. Driver inside, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. Not looking back, not wanting to be seen as part of it. Frank walked past the car, kept going. He wanted them to watch him walk. He wanted the whole block to witness that he didn't need a getaway to feel safe. Behind him, inside Unity Funeral Home, the room didn't exhale. Not yet, because Friday was coming. And everybody in Harlem understood what had really happened in there, even if nobody wanted to say it out loud. Frank Lucas hadn't come to pay respects. He'd come to turn a funeral into a deadline. And the dead man in that casket? He wasn't the point. He was the backdrop. The point was the living men who now had to choose. Give back what they stole, or get dragged into a world where street rules didn't protect you. By Monday morning, the whispers would be everywhere. In barbershops on Lenox. In back kitchens on 125th. In precinct hallways where cops pretended they didn't listen. They'd say Frank walked in alone with a gun and walked out with territory. They'd say he did it without a body dropping. They'd say even the police looked like they wanted to step aside. And the coldest part? The part Clarence would feel every time he tried to sleep? It wasn't the weapon. It was what Frank had leaned in and said at the aisle, so quietly that nobody else could quote it. But Clarence knew, because a man doesn't widen his eyes at a threat of bullets. He widens his eyes at a threat that has his full name on it.